A fortress of aluminum and steel tears through frozen clouds at 25,000 feet, trailing smoke from two dead engines. The right waist gunner is silent, slumped over his 50 caliber machine gun. Hydraulic fluid streams from the belly like arterial blood, freezing instantly in the -40 air. Below, a squadron of Messerschmitts circles like wolves, waiting for the kill that never comes. The pilot fights the yoke with both hands, feeling the aircraft shudder and buck like a dying animal. His co-pilot counts the holes in the windscreen, 9 clean punctures that somehow missed them both. The intercom crackles with damage reports from every station, a chorus of mechanical failure that should mean certain death. Yet the bomber holds its formation, engines screaming, guns still firing, refusing to fall from the sky. This was the plane German fighter pilots called the Flying Porcupine, the plane their commanders dismissed as too slow and too fat to survive the European theater. This was the bomber that Nazi propaganda mocked in newsreels, predicting its swift extinction over the Reich. So why did the same pilots who laughed at its lumbering approach begin filing reports filled with words like indestructible, supernatural, and unkillable? Why did the plane they called useless become the machine German aces learned to respect, then fear, then sometimes refuse to attack? What made a bomber built before the war, with technology the Luftwaffe considered obsolete, into something that haunted the nightmares of the world's most experienced fighter pilots? In 1943, the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe became the deadliest workplace on Earth. American bomber crews flew in broad daylight through walls of flak and swarms of Luftwaffe fighters, bleeding men and machines with every mission. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress looked like an easy target to German pilots trained to exploit every weakness in enemy aircraft. But something unexpected happened when they pressed their attacks. The war in the air was supposed to be won by speed and agility. The B-17 had neither. It couldn't outrun a fighter, couldn't outturn one, and sat in the sky like a pregnant whale compared to the sleek Focke-Wulf 190s that hunted it. Yet, by the end of the war, German pilots developed a grudging respect that bordered on superstition for this supposedly useless American bomber. The B-17 first flew in July 1935 at Boeing Field in Seattle, when European tensions were still buried under treaties and false promises. The Army Air Corps wanted a plane that could defend America's coasts by bombing ships far out at sea. Boeing delivered something else entirely. A 4-engine giant that could carry bombs across an ocean and maybe survive the journey home. The prototype crashed during evaluation trials that October, killing the crew and nearly ending the program before it began. Boeing's competitors celebrated, assuming the contract would default to their safer, proven designs. But Army observers who witnessed the crash noted something crucial. The B-17 hadn't failed mechanically. A simple pilot error, a forgotten control lock, had doomed an otherwise extraordinary aircraft. The Army ordered 13 test models anyway. Early combat proved disastrous. When the RAF borrowed a handful of B-17s in 1941, German fighters tore them apart over occupied France. British crews reported the American bomber was too vulnerable, too slow to evade, and lacked the armor to survive concentrated attacks. The defensive guns couldn't cover all approach angles, leaving blind spots a competent fighter pilot could exploit with ease. The RAF sent them back. American planners took notes but didn't listen to the conclusion. December 1941 changed everything. Pearl Harbor brought America into the war with rage and almost nothing ready to fight. The B-17S stationed in the Philippines were caught on the ground and destroyed in the first Japanese attacks. The few that survived flew desperate missions with no fighter escort, no spare parts, and no hope of reinforcement. Most never made it home. Reports from the Pacific Theater confirmed what the British had already learned. The flying fortress was a death trap, but American doctrine demanded daylight precision bombing, a strategy that required flying straight and level through enemy defenses to hit specific factories and rail yards. Night bombing, the British approach, couldn't achieve the accuracy American war planners believed necessary to cripple German industry. The B-17 was all they had, so instead of abandoning the design, Boeing and the Army Air Forces began a frantic redesign that would transform a flawed concept into something unprecedented. The B-17E model arrived in 1942 with a new tailgun position, closing the deadly blind spot German fighters had exploited from behind. The belly gained a remote-controlled turret. Armor plate went behind pilot seats and around vital systems. The bomber gained 1,500 pounds and lost speed, becoming even more sluggish in the air. On paper, it got worse. In combat, it started surviving. The first major test came in August 1942 over Rouen, France. 12 B-17 attacked railway yards in occupied territory, facing light resistance and returning with minimal damage. American commanders declared vindication. But Rouen was a probe, not a real mission. The Luftwaffe was waiting, studying, preparing for the deeper penetrations they knew would come. By January 1943, American bombers were hitting targets inside Germany itself. The missions to Wilhelmshaven and Emden showed German fighter pilots what they were really facing. B-17S arrived in formations of 50, 100, sometimes more, stacked in defensive boxes that created overlapping fields of fire. German pilots who tried head-on attacks found themselves flying through a storm of 50-caliber bullets. Those who attacked from below hit the new belly turret. Those who came from above met the top turret and waist guns. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early 1943 show a pattern of frustration pilots reported hitting B-17s with cannon fire that should have been fatal, only to watch the bomber maintain formation. They described engines on fire that somehow kept running. They documented wings with 5-foot holes, still generating lift. One German pilot claimed he put 200 rounds into a single B-17 and watched it fly home. The turning point came during the missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943. American forces sent 376 B-17 bombers deep into Germany without fighter escort, betting that defensive firepower alone could protect them. The Luftwaffe responded with over 300 fighters and threw everything at the formations for 6 straight hours. 60 B-17s went down. Another 100 came home so damaged they'd never fly again. American generals called it a victory because the ball-bearing factories were hit. Crews called it Black Thursday and wondered if they'd survive the war. But German pilots came back from Schweinfurt with something unexpected in their reports. Respect. They described B-17s with 2 engines gone, still holding formation. They documented bombers with entire sections of fuselage shot away, still flying. One Focke-Wulf pilot reported attacking a B-17 that had already been hit by at least 5 other fighters, watching his cannon shells tear into the cockpit, certain of the kill. The fortress never wavered. It dropped its bombs on target and turned for home, with both pilots dead, the co-pilot's body jamming the controls in the level position. The crew somehow flew it back to England on autopilot and instinct. The missions continued through fall and winter. Bremen, Munster, Oschersleben. Each raid cost dozens of bombers, hundreds of men. But something shifted in the German tactical reports. Fighter pilots began requesting larger cannons, heavier armament, anything that could bring down a B-17 with fewer passes. They stopped making single attack runs and started coordinating squadron-level assaults. They developed new tactics specifically for the Flying Fortress, treating it as a unique threat that required special planning. By spring 1944, the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts changed the equation entirely. German fighters now had to fight through American fighters just to reach the bombers. But even with escorts, B-17s kept taking catastrophic damage and somehow making it home. The Luftwaffe's kill-per-attack ratio against B-17s remained stubbornly lower than predictions, lower than their success against other Allied bombers, lower than logic suggested it should be. German fighter pilot reports filed throughout 1943 and 1944 consistently noted the B-17's unexpected durability. Luftwaffe intelligence summaries from the period described the bomber as having abnormal structural strength and redundant systems that allowed continued flight despite massive damage. These assessments came from pilots with years of combat experience against Soviet, British, and American aircraft. Physical evidence supported their observations. Photographs of B-17s that made it back to English bases show damage that defies belief. One famous example, a bomber called All-American, flew home with the entire tail section nearly severed, held on by a few spars and cables. Another, Memphis Belle, accumulated over 25 missions worth of battle damage, including flak holes, cannon strikes, and engine failures. The aircraft survived everything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. Statistical analysis from the 8th Air Force recorded every hit, every malfunction, every failure on returning bombers. The data showed that B-17s could lose 2 engines and maintain altitude. They could sustain structural damage to 40% of a wing and keep flying. Hydraulic systems could fail completely, and crews could still lower landing gear manually. Electrical systems could die and mechanical backups would engage. The bomber had redundancy built into redundancy. German gun camera footage from fighter attacks shows the same pattern repeatedly. Cannon shells impact B-17 wings, fuselages, and tails with visible explosions. The camera tracks the target, expecting it to break apart or fall out of formation. Instead, the bomber continues flying, often continuing to return. Fire pilots can be heard on recovered audio recordings, expressing disbelief and frustration. Captured Luftwaffe documents revealed specific tactical briefings dedicated to attacking B-17-1. Manual detailed 17 different approach angles, rating each by effectiveness and danger to the attacking fighter. It warned pilots about the overlapping defensive fire of formation, flying, and recommended attacks only when numerical superiority allowed multiple simultaneous strikes from different vectors. The document treated B-17 formations as hardened targets, requiring special weapons and tactics. Engineering analysis of recovered B-17 wrecks by German technicians produced reports praising the aircraft's construction quality. They noted the structural design distributed stress across the entire airframe, preventing single-point failures. They documented how the self-sealing fuel tanks actually worked under combat conditions, something their own aircraft lacked. They measured the armor protection and found it strategically placed to protect crew and vital systems without adding unnecessary weight. American loss records tell the other side of the story. Of the 12,731 B-17s built during the war, 4,735 were lost in combat. That's a 37% loss rate, devastating by any measure. But the Luftwaffe had predicted losses above 60% based on the bomber's speed and defensive armament. The gap between prediction and reality represented thousands of men who came home in a plane that shouldn't have survived. Individual survival stories accumulated into a collective mythology among both sides. A B-17, named Lucky Strike, took a direct flak hit that blew a 6-foot hole in the nose, killing the bombardier and navigator instantly. The blast depressurized the aircraft and knocked out 2 engines. The pilot descended to 10,000 feet, where the crew could breathe, dropped the bombs blind, and flew 300 miles back to base on two engines with no nose. German fighters intercepted twice, but broke off both times, either out of ammunition or unwilling to pursue. Another bomber, Old Faithful, accumulated 97 missions, a number that should have been statistically impossible. The aircraft returned from missions with hydraulic lines severed, control surfaces damaged, entire gun positions destroyed. Maintenance crews would patch it, and it would fly again. German intelligence identified specific aircraft by their nose art and warned pilots these were experienced crews in proven aircraft. Some fighters reportedly avoided engaging marked B-17S with high mission counts. Not everyone agreed the B-17 deserved its fearsome reputation. Some Luftwaffe pilots maintained that the bomber's legend exceeded its actual capability, arguing that proper tactics and adequate ammunition could bring down any flying fortress. They pointed to missions where German fighters achieved high kill ratios, proving the aircraft wasn't invincible. The debate within the Luftwaffe continued throughout the war, with experienced pilots respecting the B-17, while newer pilots sometimes dismissed it as Allied propaganda. The numbers support both views. On missions with heavy fighter opposition and no Allied escort, B-17 losses could exceed 20%. The bombers were vulnerable, especially to head-on attacks where the forward firepower was weakest. German pilots who exploited this discovered they could knock out pilots or engines before the defensive guns could track them. But those same tactics became suicidal once P-51 escorts arrived, and the window for successful attacks narrowed dramatically. Some historians argue the B-17's reputation came more from American propaganda than German fear. The aircraft became a symbol of American industrial might, featured in newsreels and bond drives. The Army Air Forces needed public support for the strategic bombing campaign, especially as casualty lists grew longer. Emphasizing the bomber's durability made the losses seem more acceptable, framing each returned aircraft as a small miracle rather than dumb luck. British bomber crews who flew Lancasters and Halifaxes on night missions sometimes resented the attention given to American daylight raids. They argued their own aircraft faced equal or worse danger and achieved comparable results without the dramatic losses. The Flying Fortress name itself seemed like American bragging, especially when RAF pilots knew the early models had failed miserably in British service. Some of this was inter-service rivalry, but it highlighted how perception shaped the B-17's legend. German technical assessments showed contradictions. Intelligence reports praised the B-17's engineering, while tactical summaries listed its weaknesses. The bomber was slow, poorly armed from certain angles, vulnerable to heavy cannon fire, and couldn't survive without formation support. These were facts, but the same reports noted that crews who survived to become experienced became dramatically more effective at defensive flying, formation keeping, and mutual support. An experienced B-17 formation was measurably more dangerous than a green one. The question of whether German pilots actually feared the B-17 or simply respected it as a tough target remains debated. Fear implies irrationality, a hesitation to engage beyond what tactical reality demands. Respect means acknowledging a worthy opponent while still doing your job. Luftwaffe records show both responses. Some pilots clearly developed a psychological reluctance to press attacks against damaged B-17s that kept fighting. Others maintained aggressive tactics regardless of the target's reputation. The men who flew B-17s lived inside a metal tube at 40 below zero, breathing oxygen through masks that froze to their faces, knowing that one unlucky hit could turn their aircraft into a falling coffin. Each crew consisted of 10 men whose survival depended on everyone else doing their job perfectly for 10 hours straight. The bombardier needed the pilot to hold the aircraft steady during the bomb run, the most dangerous 30 seconds of every mission. The waist gunners needed the ball turret gunner to cover their blind spots. Everyone needed the navigator to find the way home when clouds and battle damage made visibility impossible. When a B-17 went down, 10 families received telegrams. Some crews managed to bail out over enemy territory, beginning a different nightmare of capture and interrogation. Others went down with their aircraft, disappearing into the ocean or crashing in occupied Europe, with no one to recover the bodies. The survival rate for bomber crews hovered around 50%, meaning a coin flip determined whether you'd complete your 25-mission tour or die trying. The psychological toll extended beyond individual loss. Crews watched other B-17s in their formation take hits, explode, or spiral down, trailing fire. They couldn't stop or help. They could only hold position and continue the mission, knowing they might be next. Some men developed unshakable faith in the aircraft, believing the B-17 would bring them home, no matter what. Others flew in a state of controlled terror, certain each mission would be their last. Both groups kept flying because the alternative was refusing orders, which meant court-martial and disgrace ground crews developed their own relationship with the aircraft. They patched holes, replaced engines, cleaned blood from gun positions, and sent planes back into the sky, knowing some wouldn't return. Crew chiefs took personal pride in their assigned aircraft, working double shifts to keep them flying. When a B-17 went missing, the ground crew lost their plane and their purpose until a replacement arrived. Some refused to work on new aircraft, requesting transfer rather than invest emotionally in another bomber that might not come back. The B-17's unlikely success came down to engineering philosophy. Not any single technical feature. Boeing designed the bomber with structural redundancy, meaning damage to one system didn't doom the entire aircraft. Think of it like a rope made of many small fibers instead of one thick strand. Cut half the fibers and the rope still holds. German aircraft tended toward efficiency, using the minimum materials to achieve maximum performance. This made them faster and more agile, but also more fragile. A few critical hits could destroy a German fighter. The same hits on a B-17 would wound it, but rarely kill it. The defensive armament strategy also mattered more than the raw firepower numbers suggested. 13 50 caliber machine guns sounds impressive, but the real protection came from formation flying. When 30 B-17s flew in a combat box, they created overlapping fields of fire that made every approach dangerous for attacking fighters. German pilots had to choose between making quick passes that limited their accuracy or sustained attacks that exposed them to concentrated defensive fire. Either choice reduced their effectiveness. The psychological dimension exceeded the physical one. German pilots knew intellectually that B-17s could be shot down because they'd done it themselves, but the experience of hitting a bomber repeatedly and watching it keep flying created doubt. That doubt made pilots hesitate, break off attacks earlier, or choose different targets. In air combat, where split-second decisions determined survival, hesitation meant tactical defeat even without being shot down. The B-17 represented a shift in military thinking that extended beyond aviation. Traditional warfare valued mobility and hitting power, assuming that killing the enemy was the path to victory. The Flying Fortress embodied a different approach. Survival and mission completion mattered more than killing enemies. The bomber didn't need to shoot down fighters. It just needed to drop bombs on target and get its crew home. This defensive mindset, combined with overwhelming numbers, gradually wore down German fighter forces through attrition. The broader strategic impact changed how wars were fought. The B-17 proved that expensive, complex machines could achieve specific military objectives if they could survive long enough to reach their targets. This lesson influenced everything from tank design to naval doctrine. Protection and redundancy became design priorities, not afterthoughts. The evolution from the vulnerable early B-17 models to the tough later versions demonstrated that learning from combat experience and adapting quickly could overcome initial design flaws. We know the B-17 Flying Fortress started the war as a flawed design that failed in British service and suffered devastating losses in early American missions. We know Boeing and the Army Air Forces responded by adding armor, guns, and redundant systems that made the bomber heavier and slower, but dramatically more survivable. We know German pilots developed both respect and frustration for an aircraft that refused to die despite taking damage that should have been fatal. What remains less clear is whether the B-17's reputation exceeded its actual capability, or whether German pilots genuinely feared it. The statistics show it could be shot down. The survival stories show it could survive almost anything. Both truths existed simultaneously, creating a weapon system that was neither invincible nor useless, but something in between. A bomber that could be killed but was very, very hard to kill. That distinction made all the difference. The final chapters of the air war would determine whether the Flying Fortress concept succeeded or simply postponed inevitable failure through brute force numbers. The immediate tactical evolution favored the Allies. By mid-1944, P-51 Mustangs provided fighter escort all the way to targets deep in Germany, fundamentally changing the equation. German fighters now had to fight through Allied fighters to reach the bombers, reducing their effectiveness dramatically. B-17 loss rates dropped while sortie rates increased. The Luftwaffe was being ground down through attrition, losing experienced pilots faster than training could replace them. Confidence level. High German technology responded with jet fighters like the Me-262, capable of speeds that made interception nearly impossible. If deployed in sufficient numbers early enough, these jets might have shifted the balance back towards the defenders. But fuel shortages, production bottlenecks, and Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities limited their impact. By the time jets entered combat in meaningful numbers, the war was already lost. Confidence level high. The strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness remains debated among historians. Did the B-17 raids actually cripple German industry, or did they simply tie down resources that might have been used elsewhere? Post-war analysis showed German production actually increased through 1944 despite the bombing, suggesting the raids were less effective than claimed. But the diversion of German fighters from the Eastern Front and the destruction of transportation infrastructure had measurable impacts on German military capability. The truth likely sits between complete success and complete failure. Confidence level medium. For the crews still flying missions in 1945, the calculus had changed. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, making missions less dangerous but not safe. Flak remained deadly throughout the war, and mechanical failures still killed crews. Some B-17s flew their final missions in April 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. Those crews had survived when statistics said they shouldn't, in aircraft that German pilots once called useless, but learned to fear confidence level high. The B-17's legacy extended into the Cold War and beyond. The concept of the strategic bomber, the importance of defensive systems, and the value of structural redundancy all influenced subsequent aircraft design. The lessons learned over German skies shaped American military doctrine for decades. Whether the Flying Fortress was actually as feared as the legend suggests matters less than the fact that it accomplished its mission. It put bombs on target and brought enough crews home to keep flying. In war, that's the only metric that truly counts. The plane they called useless taught both sides a lesson about the difference between elegance and effectiveness. German fighters were faster, more agile, more aesthetically perfect as weapons of war. The B-17 was none of those things. It was simply hard to kill, and in the end that mattered more than anything else. If you found this story compelling, watch our next video on the secret weapon that turned the tide of the Pacific War, a story of innovation, desperation, and the engineers who refused to accept defeat. The title is The Impossible Machine That Broke Japan's Naval Code. This script drew from declassified military records, combat reports, and historical analysis. Events continue to be studied by historians, and new details emerge as documents are released. If significant new information comes to light, we'll update our understanding accordingly. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to Hidden Fixes of WWII. We uncover the untold stories, the forgotten machines, and the invisible turning points that changed history. Hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you never miss a story that deserves to be remembered.